Buongiorno a tutti,
Good morning to you all,
questo incontro che
and welcome to this session,
sicuramente a prima vista molto impegnativo.
whose title is a hard one, but don't be afraid, it's just a 1-hour session.
Un pensiero su un percorso,
We won't go into details
quello ricchissimo
on the thoughts and very complex experience and fruitful experience of Father Giussani.
a rendere conto a un pubblico più vasto di quello, diciamo,
We will just talk
gli addetti
to an audience, which today is going to be wider than usual experts, of what happened some months ago, from the 11th to the 13th of December 2007, at the Faculty of Theology at the University of Lugano, Switzerland.
fuori.
This is the only faculty outside Italy where Italian is the language spoken as the main language.
Come un ponte tra la teologia
So this is a sort of bridge between theology, with T as a capital letter, connected to Northern Europe, as in German and French theology, and theology with a small letter of Mediterranean countries, as in Italy, Spain, and so on.
Quindi l'incontro di oggi è previsto come un rendere
So
conto di quello che
today's session will focus on what happened at that conference.
il coraggio di una facoltà di teologia che
The Faculty of Theology was brave enough.
fonda nel
It is the first one in Europe, and for the second time worldwide, it has organized a conference not on Giussani as an educator and on all his power as an educator, leading to the movement of communion and liberation, and therefore the meeting, but rather a conference on his thoughts, as in Giussani as a theologian, as a philosopher.
affrontare con rigore scientifico come
So,
richiede
from a strict scientific point of view, as required by theology, the conference has talked about all the richness and complexity of Giussani's thoughts.
vedremo gli sviluppi ecumenici.
And we will see also the ecumenical development, because we can rightly understand Giussani's charisma and the charisma of this movement. Giussani gets in contact with other Christian beliefs, in particular the Orthodox Church, the Jews, and Islam.
Pensato di invitare insieme al
Together with the rector of the Faculty of Theology of Lugano, Professor René Roux, we also wanted to invite one of the most important members of the scientific committee that long worked on the organization of the conference. We also have with us in the first row Professor Maximadi, who was the secret organizer of that meeting, so to speak. We also wanted to invite today Professor André Maria Gerumanes, who is a professor of moral theology at the University of Lugano, in order to present his report, which gave an in-depth analysis
il legame
of the link and the mutual esteem between Giussani and Balthasar.
passaggio delle novità emerse dal convegno di direttamente dall'archivio Balthasar
During the meeting, we could see some letters, and we could read some letters. There were so many letters that were exchanged between the two. Unfortunately, André Marie Gerumanis cannot be with us today because of health reasons, and therefore we have with us just the rector, René Roux, who comes from Val d'Aosta in Italian northern region, actually comes from there. And he made philosophical and theological studies in 1991. Then he specialized in Eastern studies in Rome, Oxford, and Paris. From 2000 to 2003, is a professor at the Theological Institute of Sant'Anselmo in Val d'Aosta. Then he also taught in Rome, in Africa, in India, in Germany. And since 2010, he is a full professor of the history of Asian Church, pathologies, and Eastern churches of the University of Erfurt in former Eastern Germany. He is a pro-dean. He became pro-dean of this faculty and dean in 2012. In 2014, so quite recently, he was appointed rector of the Faculty of Theology at the University of Lugano, and 2 years later, he was appointed chairman of the Association of Private Universities recognized by the state in Switzerland. He studies Greek and Syrian theologies, the history of theology hermeneutics, and the theory of religions. I'm going to ask the first question which comes to my mind. But why did you organize a meeting on Giussani? How did the idea come about? And I don't want to be polemical here, but clearly you must be, let's say, brave enough, and you must be wise enough in order to organize such a conference. But first of all, thank you very much, not only for having organized this meeting, but also for being with us today. Okay, I want to thank you for this invitation. I'm really very pleased to be here, and I send you my regards from my colleague, Professor Andrea Maria Gerumanis, who unfortunately is not with us today. The idea of the conference on Giussani is connected to two reasons. The faculty of Lugano was founded by Monsignor Eugenio Correcco, that was very close to Giussani, about 25 years ago. So last year we celebrated the 25th anniversary. It was created as an attempt to develop an academic theology to the service of the church and the society as a whole. So it was a sort of a test, experiment made by Monsignor Correcco. Years went by, things changed, and on the 25th anniversary, at the beginning of the new century and millennium, we had to ask one question to ourselves. What is the new theology needed today? The people studying with me in the second half of the 1980s, well, that was a long time ago. At that time, we used to speak about communism. Today, communism is no longer that clear. Even in the clergy, the situation has pretty much changed. So the faculty has thought about organizing some initiatives in order to think about the meaning of theology, what does it mean today to be a theologian, and what a faculty of theology should do today. Among different initiatives, we wanted to focus on some distinguished personalities. This is how the scientific committee set some criteria, which were actually very simple. The first criterion was to talk about Italian or Italian-speaking culture. As was said, the Faculty of Theology in Lugano is the only faculty of theology, apart from those in the Vatican City, but that's a different story, which is Italian-speaking. Therefore, we wanted to focus on some author coming from this cultural area, which plays a very important role in Catholic terms. The second criterion was that the thoughts of the theologian had to be an impact. Theology is not just what you write, although theologians do write, but we wanted to have to speak about somebody who has had an impact on people's lives. So a theological thought which would be fertile, which could move people's souls. We were not just interested in speaking a theology for the sake of itself. The third criterion was that the local area should play a very important role. Canton Ticino in Switzerland is quite a small one. It is quite a peculiar territory, so to speak. So thinkers, to some extent, had to be connected to the clergy of Canton Ticino, for example. And the fourth criterion was to carry out academic research. We wanted to give a contribution to make an in-depth analysis, which is the primary role of the Faculty of Theology. And this is how it was very easy to list a few names. And the first name on the list was Father Giussani, who played a very important role on the Catholic Church in Canton Ticino. It also had a direct impact on the Faculty of Theology through Monsignor Correcco. Therefore, Father Giussani was the person to talk about. Then we also chose another person in order to strike a balance. That was Cardinal Martini in Canton Ticino. He played an important role. He studied philology, and it's very difficult to tell the students of theology that they have to study ancient languages in order to understand the Bible. And so we had these two people. So from a political perspective, it could be a problem to talk about them. We all know the history and the situation. However, this choice has enabled us to understand the real mission of a Faculty of Theology, as in its role is to contribute to have an in-depth analysis. That's why we organized the conference on Father Giussani. Some people thought it would only be connected to some part of the church, but actually the conference was welcomed as it really was, as in we set up a scientific committee that chose the main topics, and this conference was organized in December last year. Maybe later on I will tell you about some aspects of this conference and how it was welcomed by our faculty. Now, this is the first reason why this conference was organized. I remember the meeting we had in the organization committee for the 25th anniversary of the faculty when this idea was launched. A dear friend and colleague from Communion and Liberation said, "But you're crazy, you can't do that. This is going to create us problems." But at the end of the day, I come from Germany. I went to Switzerland to work. I come from Val d'Aosta. And that's why I wanted to do something crazy. I wanted to be brave enough. This is why I thought I could contribute this way. We also realized that in other contexts it could have been more difficult to talk about these topics. In Switzerland, we are, let's say, far enough. We could be rather quiet to speak about these very interesting topics for us. And then there is a second reason why we organize this conference, which goes back to the distant past. And this is connected to my own person and my own personal experience. When I worked in Germany, in departments, faculties of theology, I had the feeling that some colleagues, when they wrote, were not far-sighted thinkers, so to speak. There was a sort of dominant culture. There was a thought that was based on Kant, the philosopher, and therefore they thought that some things could no longer be said. Kant said that from a scientific point of view, metaphysics cannot be studied, and as a theologian and a Catholic, he finds it difficult to use metaphysical thoughts. Which can be found in our thoughts as Catholics. So there was a sort of fear among these colleagues. Now, to me, that was totally useless. I mean, that would mean to limit, to put constraints to the freedom of thought and creativity. And why should we not do that? Is that because maybe we wouldn't be understood? But are we sure that we're not going to be understood? Or maybe are we not brave enough to ask questions and to make an in-depth analysis? Then it's not that I'm smarter than them, and I didn't know why I was open to have an in-depth analysis or to question some forms of dominant thought. And I realized that that was due to the fact that when I was in high school, I read a few books. And all of a sudden, I wanted to tell my colleagues in Germany, try to read those books. Try to also get familiar with another form of thought. There are some people in Germany who are close to this, like Ratzinger and Balthasar. But as you know, in the academic world, there's a fashion, there's a majority. It's not just the pure thought prevailing. So it was necessary to do something that could attract people's attention. At that time, I was dealing with the history of the ancient church. So I was committed to a totally different story, to a totally different topic. And since I had this experience in the far past, and in Lugano, somebody proposed to talk about Father Giussani, to me it was like the providence, and therefore I supported it as best as I could.
Thank you. So, trying to even though in a partial way, for those who are interested in the 3 days of conference, there is a publication by Tombolini, published by Cantagalli, with the smiley face of Father Giussani. This book, which you can find also here, it is a new book. It has just been published. And well, we all, and you said so in your introduction, with a few surprises here. We made a few discoveries, and even though we do not know where this will take us, new research paths opened up. Reading the index of this book, I'm going to try in like a couple of minutes to outline the work carried out during the conference, the historic background with an intervention by Professor Bocci on Father Giussani in the Ambrosian Catholicism, and then going to the contents of his thought, theological anthropology, the vision of man, Professor Prato, myself, Marco Lamanna, with an intervention entitled Don Giussani replies to the Kantian challenge, and then the sources of Monsignor Giussani's thoughts. And here we have the contribution by Massimo Borghesi, who highlighted the relationship between Father Giussani and Reinhold Niebuhr, whom he studied at university. Well, there are some constraints because obviously, as you might know, there are some limitations because there is a beatification process going on at the moment, so we cannot actually open up all the different thoughts. But there are two main works by John Henry Newman. And there is also a contribution by Professor Conrad on the relationship between Father Giussani and Newman. And then Jacques Selvet, who's a Jesuit, a great friend of Balthasar, talked about the relationship between Giussani and de Lubac. And last but not least, the contribution by Monica Scholz-Zappa, relationship between Giussani and Guardini. And I really recommend her book, which is extremely important and interesting. Then there was a part devoted to the meetings. So again, Alberto Savorana, the relationship between Giussani and Balthasar, and then Giussani and John Paul II, and Cardinal Ratzinger, then Benedict XVI. Here again, some very interesting details emerged. The weekly meetings near the church of Santa Maria Maggiore between Ratzinger and Giussani. And then the relationship between Giussani and Correco. And this is the most surprising version, so to speak. Ecumenism. With a participation by Sophie Makul, the Arab translator of Giussani, a lecture by the Anglican representative of Anglican Orthodoxy, John Milbach, And this contribution by Alexander Filonico from the university, a university in Ukraine, that shows how an Orthodox can actually follow the thought of Giussani while remaining an Orthodox. Then there is a session entitled Educational Worries, with a very interesting intervention by Professor Roux on Giussani and exegesis. And here I would like to ask also my guest's opinion. Professor Braschi started from the liturgy, the lived liturgy, the importance attributed to liturgy, and the new way to look at the liturgical dimension in the Christian experience, and Giulio Maspero, who talked about how Giussani used, in a very fascinating and original way, of all the literary contributions, all the authors that he loved, like Giacomo Leopardi, whom he taught to generations of students. And then a session, a short one, on the enormous quantity that we as scholars need to study of the works by Father Giussani. So a very interesting contribution by Professor Bressan, who had a very smart way to look at Father Giussani's library. So which were his favorite authors. So, well, this is my advice to you. If you're going to buy this book, which I think you will do, obviously, well, start from the end of the book. When you read a thriller, sometimes you go just to the very last page to find out who the murderer is. Well, this Lectio Magistralis was held by Julian Carron, the legacy of Father Giussani, the real path and the experience. This is not a book that you can read on the beach, obviously. Well, it's about 500 pages. You can read it, well, over time. But even if you read it piece by piece, starting from the end. Now, I'm asking my guest, you as a theologian, as a professor, what impressed you most during the conference? What are the things that really had an impact on you because they were unexpected from your point of view? Well, there are some aspects that are linked with the experience of the conference, which maybe went a bit beyond the normal boundaries of a theological conference. So, well, usually this kind of conferences are part of our work as theologians. Our initial purpose, as I said, was that of a research. So what we wanted to do was to have to take stock, so to speak, of the situation, to have an overview of the situation done up to now on Father Giussani. And we wanted that the result, the outcome of this work could be, so to speak, a starting point for all future research studies. So this in a way explains why the work was structured this way, the importance that was attached to sources and instruments. But there were some surprises for me. There were two surprising aspects. First of all, the presence of Communion and Liberation members who told me we found out new aspects in Father Giussani. Well, that is quite obvious for me, because that's something that has always interested me, but I'm not an expert. But those people who have always followed the work by Father Giussani, the fact that they could find something new, something they had not known before, well, this was something that really was really satisfying for us. And as Andrea Marie Romani said, there was a very nice atmosphere. Some colleagues participated from the very beginning in the adventure of the Theological Faculty of Lugano. Correco wanted to be a new experience in terms of theological faculty, and Andrea Marie told me, well, I had the impression that I was reliving the same experiences of the beginning of the faculty. We met because we were moved by the same passion for Christ, for the church, which takes a specific shape, that of an intellectual work. So this aspect, let's say this more superficial aspect was the one that had the greatest impact on me. From the point of view of the content of the conference, there was this dimension of the ecumenical impact of Father Giussani and his work. If we go to the very heart of the Christian experience, you find that there are connections to our Orthodox brothers who also discover a way to get closer to this center. So this is exactly what theology should do, in a way, as a model, as a food for thought. And this is a very interesting dimension that emerged from the conference. And then there is another aspect, maybe this is less surprising, that is to say, Father Giussani's ability to unite, to put together different aspects, reflections on the Holy Scriptures, on theology. These are things that cannot be done in a separate way, apart from Christian life. So this is what actually strengthens the Christian thought, and this is also the engine that moves us. So these are the aspects that most impressed me during the conference. Some are new, some are not so new. As a theological faculty, we realized that it is really advisable to take a look at different realities. Scientific theology does not mean only to comment or to translate works that were done elsewhere, as if the theological work is something that is only for a small group of people. On the contrary, we have to go through our real experience.
C'è anche dei ciellini.
So you were talking about community liberation members and what you said about them. So there is, in a way, this effect, this unexpected effect of the enormous quantity of works and of studies in during the first years after his theological studies. Father Giussani's theological studies, and this was encouraged by the extraordinary openness of the seminar of Venegono, where he studied. And we are now in the 1950s, and from a theological point of view, these were difficult years, because it was enough to use certain words that one was accused of being a modernist. Giussani studied Reinhold Niebuhr, who is a Protestant author that also from a methodological point of view had a strong impact on Giussani's thought, and he studies Newman, and also with something that was called Nouvelle Theology, but that was done with a certain amount of criticism. So Balthasar, for instance, Giussani studied Guardini, so he is really hungry for knowledge. And then there are other aspects which are also extraordinary. And I'm thinking about a student of theology that listens to the records by his professor to learn Russian. His professor was the great scholar Monsignor Gabbiati. And then there is something else, something which is not completely new, but nevertheless surprising. That is to say, how in neo-scholastic formalism, in a very rigid theology that was starting to show some fractures which would then grow bigger and bigger after the Council, the Vatican Council, the centrality of Christ, the synthetic word that no one had used before, that is to say, presence. Yesterday, Cardinal Scola talked in a very emotional way what this meant in his life and what it means in the lives of many of us, probably of every one of you who are here today, to talk about Christ as a presence. Christ is present. So this courage and this rigor, which is humble in a way, and this courage to expose one's humanity. And in the preface to the origin of the Italian presumption, we say we can discover Christ only by asking ourselves, who am I? Today, we often use expressions such experience in a very superficial way. Meeting is another word, another expression we use superficially. And I think this is, I think it is very useful, the expression used by Scola. Well, at a certain point, in specific circumstances that were generated by the perception that Christ, who is a character of the figure of the past, a great master of morality, of doctrine, and not a contemporary reality. So then Christianity could only be a devoted memory, and it would not be able to change life, making it more fascinating. So I realized that everyone is actually quoting this. You can find it almost everywhere. that is to say, the opening phrase of the Deus Caritas Est, Christianity is not above all a doctrine, it is the event of the encounter with a person who gives a new path to life. But to talk about this encounter 50 years ago, to talk about experience, well, this was really unusual. I was really impressed by what Julian Caron said after a tour in the United States. He said to talk about Christianity as an event, well, this means that we do not quite understand each other yet. It is as if these categories were still almost unknown to us. But if this is not a contemporary reality, inevitably Christianity becomes a moral doctrine. And the outcomes are here for all to see. And I'm thinking about the American church, but not only that church. These are open paths. Each of us uses these things to live. The problem today is not to know who is right, but rather how to live. So the fact that we are given back through patience and humility and rigor, scientific rigor in theological studies, the depth of this initial thought is a contribution to the reason of what we're living. And I'd like to make an example, and here again I'm addressing Professor Roux, not so much as a rector of the faculty responsible for the conference, to express himself, because you already mentioned this surprise, the way you were surprised when you heard Alessandro Filonico saying in a very quiet way, but also corroborating it with quotes. I found in the experience of the meeting described by Giussani the same elements that made me convert from the communist I was during the Soviet Empire to a new Christian, following the words and the thoughts of Antonio di Suros, who said Christianity is an encounter. And well, this is how the Holy Spirit works. These threads, which are normally invisible in everyday disputes and controversies, well, these threads blossom somehow from a plant that we thought was almost dead, the plant of the Christian experience. So one of the things that really impressed me was listening to René Roux when he said that this is a theme that, in a way, each of us had to handle, to face. That is to say, how Father Giussani reads the scriptures. Here, yesterday, Professor Weiler expressed his surprise for the passion of Father Giussani for the Old Testament. Many of us were fascinated by the way in which the gospel becomes alive, so to speak, in the reading, in the communication by Father Giussani. So the fact that an expert like Professor Roux, who reads the New Testament in a very personal way, so to speak, and he says this is a new way to approach exegesis. And this is a call for awareness, so to speak. So I would like to ask for these, well, we have still about 20 minutes. I would like to ask you to help this wider audience, because we are not all philosophers and theologians here, to understand why you said that this form, this kind of exegesis is a new thing.
Well, I'll tell you how we came to this. As I said beforehand, I was very interested in the history of hermeneutics and theological hermeneutics, especially in ancient times. And I thought about reading some books that I was really fascinated by. Giussani could read some pages of the Deeds of the Apostles. That's why when I participated in the scientific committee, I thought it would be quite an interesting topic to debate. And I would like to have some experts talking about this. And then the scientific committee asked me to do that. So I prepared something, and I realized that so far nothing had ever been done, which is somewhat strange because Giussani was really able to read, interpret, and make his students, his youth, understand the Bible. So I simply tried to understand what Giussani was doing and why maybe it did it differently. So in order to understand what Giussani did, I tried to understand the situation in the 1950s when he started with his catechesis and his analysis. And here I understood a few things, a few elements, which I'm going to share with you. The relation with the Bible, with the Holy Writings, is absolutely fundamental, especially starting from the Vatican Council. It was more and more important. The Church was committed to that. Just like before the Vatican Council, the Bible was not read, and then it was read in Italian so that everybody could understand. So there was great enthusiasm for the Bible, but that neglected the fact that, first of all, the Bible is not easy to read and to understand. It's not enough to open the Bible and to read it to understand it. There are many problematic issues, questioning faith because it's a different world, because there's many more elements to that. So it's not enough to open the Bible and all of a sudden the Holy Spirit enlightens us and we can understand everything and my faith is going to be strengthened. It's very complex. In those years, the church in general, Protestant church and the Catholic church, had one of the major crises in its relations with the Bible. The first crisis was in the early Christianity. Many Christians didn't accept the Old Testament at the beginning because it was too far away from the image of Christ. And the fathers of Christ created a Christian hermeneutics of all the Bible so that the Old Testament could be read as one of the main witnesses of God's Word. Then there are still some difficulties which are connected to interpret it, which are connected to the historical and critical exegesis. There was a lot of interest in the Bible. All the possible tools were used to understand it more and more, but historical and critical exegesis which is based on the method that you don't believe in God's existence, is not probably the most suitable way to understand the text which we read out of our faith. That was a very strong problem, a very harsh problem, especially for the Protestant church, where the reference to the Bible is of the utmost importance. And then there was further research on that. And therefore, it was like faith was being broken, dismantled, and the mainstream and traditional churches are now having a collapse in the number of believers. And one of the reasons, to me, is the interpretation with the Holy Bible. The Catholic Church also had this problem. So you read the pieces of the Bible, but how can you approach a text? How can you read John's Gospel if somebody says that this Gospel was not written by John, but by a community? Some pieces were put together by somebody whom we don't know. Should that be the basis for our faith? So there are doubts. Giussani, in the 50s, in high school, wanted to explain his students, who at that time was the intellectual elite of the country. What could he do? Either he could go through the traditional catechesis, where you would read the catechesis, and then you would read some excerpts of the Bible. But from an intellectual point of view, that was no longer suitable for that target group. Or he could provide the results of the historical and critical exegesis, but through that he would risk creating some faith crisis. There were some professors that through these studies became atheists, and before they were Jesuits, probably because their methodology was not critical enough. They were theologians, they were enthusiastic about science. I'm a historian and I know the constraints of that approach, but I understand that other people maybe thought that they would find the truth that they couldn't find. I think that Giussani followed a different path. He drew inspiration from the Archbishop of Milan, Montini, who recovered the old concept of religious meaning, religious sense, and gave a guideline, as he said in one of his letters. In reading the Bible, what is really important is to highlight the religious sense of man. The religious sense must be educated. It is present in every one of us, but it's not always educated in the most proper way. There can be wrong answers, and we see that today, when in the name of religions, murder is done, terrorist attacks are done, and that's a religious sense which is totally wrong. Montini gave this guideline, and when reading the Bible, it is important to highlight this dimension. I believe that Giussani drew inspiration from this guideline and implemented it, applied it. So in his contact, in his relation with the Bible, he overcame this problem connected to the critical thinking. Because what he looked for was not just the literary origin, what can be historically proved with other sources, but the history of human experience, which is the encounter with God, with Christ, with the Word of God, that can be a historical truth. This attention to people's experience, in my opinion, leads to a correct hermeneutical attitude. So, if I tell an encounter, a meeting I had with my friends yesterday, and the same friends tell about the same meeting, our way to speak about it is not going to be the same 100% because each one has been struck by something different. But the life of that meeting is the same, and this is the most important thing. So, if you read the New Testament or the Old Testament under that perspective, you can really understand its most important part. It's not that problems disappear, but basically they play a secondary role. They become irrelevant. When I read in John's Gospel, the first meeting was at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It's not that important to understand whether the meeting at 4 o'clock in the morning is told by John himself or by somebody else. But what is important to understand is the importance of that meeting. So you understand that this is how we can see, we can understand the Bible for what it wants to be. Another important aspect of Giussani's exegesis is the fact that we should verify what is said. Hence, faith. So, when you read about the encounter with Christ, it is not interesting to know that that happened 2,000 years ago, but we want to know whether this encounter was meaningful and is meaningful for me today. This is how this encounter can become real. It's not interesting for me, as in, if it's true that John and Matthew met Christ and encountered Christ, it's not because it's historically true, but because they encounter God's Son. If that's true, then it is possible for me today too. And this is the interpretation of the role of Peter, the role of the authorities, as Father Giussani said. So I do understand the real experience made by the first disciples in the Old Testament, by the prophets, by those following the Word of God, because it is true for me today. And for me, it is possible to do this experience today inside this community. To me, this is the most important contribution, one of the most important contributions of Father Giussani's approach. Which is not that new, which is not brand new. This is the way to connect with the Bible as something alive in our community, which belongs to the clergy tradition. What is new in Giussani is the fact that the critical context where he paved the way is a critical context where he paved the way, because he didn't explain it. These are my own ideas starting from his analysis and his observation of the world. This is why Father Giussani was so original, because he has paved a new way which makes the approach to the Bible credible even from a human and intellectual point of view. And I was struck when I read in Savorana's biography something said by a girl. That could approach me and connect me with the Bible, and I thought it would have been impossible. So I told you this just to give you a sort of historical context, an analysis of the exegesis that we can find in Giussani, and an attempt to understand the underlying logic in our approach to the Bible.
I hope that you could, so to speak, have a taste of the quotation, like an appetizer, since it's almost lunchtime, of the kind of work that is currently underway. And I, in a way, go back to what Professor Roux just said. This interpretation isn't completely new. This is how, during the first centuries, Christians looked at the holy text as something alive. So, well, what Father Giussani said is, I didn't want to create something new. I do not want to be original in what I do. I just wanted to propose it in a more probably fascinating and persuasive way the essential factors and elements of Christianity. And we are encouraged to give a more, a stronger existential weight to what we do in our everyday life. So we need to realize that if we don't want to create anything new, we end up being original in a way. So this is a very important contribution. So I really invite you all to buy this book on the conference. And then, well, this isn't an advertisement, a marketing strategy. This is one of the ways we do theology. As Professor Roux said, someone needs to, well, think and study, but there is a whole life behind. So this is the great intuition which is studied in the faculty of Lugano. So, well, nothing can be separated from life that generates everything, every form of study and thinking. So maybe by reading this book, you can have, you can find out that you have questions, you need to know more, and a dialogue might start that could open up new perspectives. So I'd like to thank Professor Roux for his participation. He said, well, there were so many people who worked, like other professors and colleagues who worked at this conference. Then I'm the one who's going to be applauded. Well, this is an applause for the whole of the faculty and for all who committed themselves to the